And then as far as defensive gun uses go, this is a very core question in the gun debate. How often do people actually use firearms to defend themselves? Because you'll see estimates that are, range across the spectrum from maybe, tens of thousands of times a year up to 2.5 million times per year. Your survey puts the number at 1.6 million. Can you just explain a little bit more about how you got to that number, how it's different from some of these other estimates, especially like some of the previous survey estimates, like the CLEC surveys in the 90s?
Yeah. So, maybe the first thing to note is that, this estimate around 1.6 million is in line with some of these classic surveys from a decade or two ago, as well as some more recent surveys. But one of the challenges with ascertaining defensive gun use is how you define that. So something that has shown up consistently in the literature, and it shows up in a big way in this survey, is that most defensive gun use, over 80% of the times that people are indicating they're using a gun to defend themselves, a shot is not fired. And and what we wanted to do in this survey is really get at sort of any cases for which someone thought a firearm was used in self-defense. And so we asked two sorts of questions. One was a straightforward question. Have you ever used a firearm to defend yourself? And we explicitly excluded work in the military as a police officer, as a security guard. So we're not interested in professional uses. And if someone answered yes to that, then we asked them a number of detailed questions. How many times have you used a gun to defend yourself? What sort of firearm did you use? How many assailants were there? Did you fire a shot? If you fired a shot, how many? So we have some really granular data on that. And then as a separate question, because you can imagine other scenarios where you might, be on your property with a rifle on your shoulder, on your land, and there's some dispute, and somebody, when they notice your arm, they politely walk away, or maybe a friend comes to your aid with a firearm that's displayed, but you didn't use it. So we have a different question asking about these more sort of softer marginal cases where the presence of a firearm might have deterred aggression against somebody.
Oh, interesting.
So that's a separate question. But on the straight defensive gun use question, we also ask, did you brandish the firearm? Did you shoot the firearm? Did you, verbally announce you had a firearm? So we have a breakdown of how these things happened. And what does show up is that, yes, in most cases, it's simply the brandishing of a firearm or the knowledge that somebody has a firearm, the threat that is able to deter crime. And so, one thing this means is if you're trying to ascertain defensive gun use through other measures, there's a debate in the literature. Should you look at, emergency room numbers, the amount of people who come in with gunshot wounds? And on the surface of it, those numbers, are in the tens of thousands, generally under 100,000. And the question is,
the common critique there is that survey-based estimates are overestimating how common these events are. And actually, before we talk a little bit more about the emergency room and some of the other ways people estimate lower rates of defensive gun use, one of the key critiques of the CLEC surveys and the other surveys from the 90s is that they asked whether or not you used a gun in self-defense in the past year. And so there was a lot of concern that people maybe overestimated how recently their use of a gun for self-defense is. Now, you've addressed this concern in this survey, right? You asked this question in a different way.
Yeah, and so this is a really interesting sort of critique. It's what social scientists are often kind of thinking about in subtle, sophisticated ways. And the argument is this, that if you have a survey that asks, did you use a gun in self-defense in the last year? Probably using a gun in self-defense is a pretty memorable thing. That's going to stick in someone's memory. But the precise length of time that has passed, that might be a little fuzzy. So, if somebody defended themselves with a gun the previous summer, we're talking in September right now, maybe that's actually 13 months away. But you might say, oh, yeah, just last year I defended myself. Or maybe it's 14 months or 15 months. So the worry then is if you're then using this yearly metric to calculate defensive gun uses, you might have a lot of respondents that did use guns defensively, but used it slightly beyond that year-long boundary. And that's going to perhaps inflate the number of defensive gun uses that you're counting within a single calendar year. So it's a plausible concern, and a thoughtful thing to be worried about. So what we did in the survey is we asked if you've ever used a firearm in self-defense. So this is any time in your life. And I do think those are memorable events. So there's something that somebody might remember, even if it was 5-10 years ago. And if they say that, we ask also, how many times has this happened? And we drill down on all of those. And for each incident, we're asking a whole bunch of detail. But what that means is that we get an overall report for gun owners of how often, or if at all, they've used guns defensively. And what you can then do is back out in terms of the life years represented by the survey respondents in the survey, and say, how much does that actually amount to per year? So,
Right.
From what's indicated in our survey, it's around 50 million defensive uses that we're counting. But that's, of course, over people who might be 80 years old compared to 18 years old. So we're actually then calculating based on the life years represented in the survey respondents, what does that look like per year? And it's really interesting that when you back those numbers out, you end up with this estimate 1.67, which is very tightly aligned with prior estimates. And I should also note that it's, if anything, I think this is a conservative estimate because...
Right, yeah, actually, let's talk about that real quick. Well, one, I do think it's fascinating that using a totally different methodology for estimating yearly defensive gun uses, you still come out to what is in the range of those previous survey estimates. So that's, to me, that signals there's perhaps more credibility to these estimates, that this is how often Americans say that they've used guns in self-defense. And now it did come out on the lower end of that range, because the collect range was something between 1.6 and 2.5 million per year. But can you talk a little bit about why that might be, and why, as you just said, you think your estimate might be actually a bit of an undercount?
Yeah. So there's two things that we can't capture in this survey. One is this survey is only going to those who are 18 and older. So certainly there's many millions of people under the age of 18 who hunt, who are involved in shooting sports. Teenagers who are proficient in the use of guns and whatnot. And you do see reports in the news every so often of 14-year-old, 16-year-old, 17-year-old who defends their family at home from an invader or a robber, that sort of thing. So there might be some defensive uses in that under 18 age group that we're not capturing. But the bigger issue that we can't get at with this survey is if somebody is not currently a gun owner, they wouldn't have been filtered into the full part of our survey that asks all these questions. But Kleck found something really interesting in some of his early work, which is that a number of people who indicated that they'd used a gun in self-defense weren't personally the owners of that gun. So you might have a wife whose husband owns a gun, and in this survey, the husband might indicate, yeah, I'm a gun owner. The wife would say, yeah, I'm not a gun owner. But the wife might have used a gun in self-defense and somebody trying to break in the house. And that population, it was actually pretty large in some of Kleck's estimates, up to 40%, I believe, in one of his surveys, where you had people who had used a gun for self-defense at some point in their history who weren't themselves personal gun owners or owning that particular gun. So that we're also not able to capture that group. And just as sort of a robustness exercise, if we go in and calculate based on Kleck's estimates, how many people that might encompass that weren't in our survey, we do get up in that sort of 2.5 million range. So so it is, sort of all methods of triangulating this are coming up with similar sets of answers. And, there's other things going on in the background. Certainly population has grown a bit in the United States in the last 2 decades, but also crime has come down for most of the last 3 decades. It's certainly coming up the last year or two.
So that's why you might see a lower rate.
So you might see a lower rate. You also have a higher population. So, but all these numbers are really, in the same neighborhood, which does give us more confidence that that we're really picking up, something real, a phenomenon that is persistent over time and really captures the behavior of gun owners in America. And again, and this is a sample of 15,000, 16,000 gun owners who are consistently reporting these sorts of levels of self-defense.